Okay.
So you deal with a lot of weapons. In fact, earlier when some weapons came through the door, we saw some weapons. And I'm curious. So one of my favorite weapons is a kopesh. Right? And so as well as talking a bit about that, can you, I don't know, as long or as short as you want, explain the theory of how you construct how to fight with a weapon like that, which there's nothing really written down about it. There are obvious problems with trying to learn this particular weapon.
Yes. Okay. So this is one of those situations where it's like it's good to be wrong in this kind of way. So that's my dog making crazy, of course, making crazy.
My dog does the same thing.
So with the kopesh, I'm trying to see how to. I've had to, and I'm constantly in a state of re-evaluating my positions and my understanding of what this weapon is and how it was used. So the easy part is this: if you can get a hold of a historically accurate replica made from the same material, then the easy part is understanding what it can do, right? You don't have to be anyone special to figure out when you have it in your hand what this weapon can do, provided that it's reconstructed, that it's a true to form, right? So that's the easy part. Like the kopesh, forget all the exoticness of its shape. It has that curved edge, and it cuts. It's a cutting weapon. I know that, and I'll bring out this steel one here. Now this thing is not historically accurate. One's made out of steel, and two, it's enormous, right? It's not right. But okay, so we see these kind of portions here or here, and say, okay, this weapon, it's probably is used for like hooking shields, or we try to like come up with different ways to make this make sense. But sometimes I feel like we ignore the most basic aspect of it, which is this edge right here. And that was a lesson that I had to learn, because we started doing reconstruction of the kopesh with not the right specs for the weapons. And so as my understanding of like the actual dimensions of the blade start to get better, then my understanding of how you can cut with it has improved. So I went from, I should say, trying to figure out the way to reconstruct it based off of the shape, purely by its shape, and more the exotic features of its shape than the actual functional features of its shape. So I started off doing that. And then once I started to realize that the shape was wrong and I needed to make it smaller, then it brings up some obvious questions about, well, okay, so this thing is, at its longest, probably 24 inches here in the States would be considered a long kopesh for the time. And so we're dealing with a really short weapon. Like, is it truly used? Is that its only purpose? That's why it's really on the battlefield, is to hook shields, So can it hook shields? I've done some experiments. Yeah, it can hook shields. It can hook shields better than I thought that it could, right? But again, the primary function of it is for cutting. And then this goes into other questions. So I started to make it, so backing up a little bit. So we started making our drills a little easier, a little simpler, and started to say, well, okay, bronze is pretty soft. defense would have been primarily been using the shield, right? So primary defense will focus on the shield. So we have to have a shield to understand at least how this works. And from there, we started to reconstruct based off of other stick and shield style fighting that you find in East Africa and in other places within that locale, and then prioritizing those areas that are closest to. And then as we go out a little further, they have less of a priority, but they still offer us information of that kind of the use. So like Nguni stick fighting wasn't our primary thing to look at for helping to reconstruct, but it is very instructive in that it's in essence the same type of tech and material. But we will look more to like Nuba stick fighting, which would use stick and shield first, and then because of this proximity. I was going to say, sorry, I'm all over the place. So when we're researching the Khopesh, we found that in Tutankhamun's tomb there were a number of curved and crooked sticks that he had with him, and some of these sticks are walking sticks, and some of them are quite clearly like replicas of fetters, if you will, of Khopesh, these curved blades. And I read this really interesting article by a historian and a fencer named Picone, and he wrote an essay on stick fencing in ancient Egypt and its connection to the weapons training. And he brought up a really interesting point of that for the Egyptians, since we're at that early stage of where sword is actually beginning to become distinguished from the knife due to better ways of hilting and better ways of making better material for the blade itself. So once, as humans, we got to this point, we started to see the separation of the knife or dagger into becoming the sword or whatever else. So for Egypt, they're right at that early period of time where the Khopesh could be considered a long knife, or not quite a sword, like in the sense that we think of a sword. So they're in this really early stage. So for them, whereas today, how should I say this? For them, the what informs their use of the Khopesh would have been their stick fighting, is what he was in essence saying. Whereas today, it's kind of the opposite. It's kind of the other way around. Like Mathrak comes from a sword art. Kali Eskrima, they practice now with sticks, but it came from using an edge weapon. So it's kind of flipped around. So for the Egyptians, the stick and even the axe would have been like these early models for using the Khopesh. So we're following in their footsteps. We look at the stick fighting from the region and to give us those kind of clues and that kind of understanding. But primarily the weapon is what's telling us what it can and can't do, and then try not to martial art-ize things, because it's easy to take the weapon and say, okay, man, I'm doing Kali now, what I'm saying, with my Khopesh, trying not to do that kind of stuff as well, but sticking to real simple basics, understanding of moving around the shield, using the shield to close and block off lines, and then striking at simple strikes at exposed areas was where we were at now. Well, I should say then. So I've been talking with a friend of mine. She's an Egyptologist. She's written a book, and I may have her book here. If I have it in arm's reach, I'll pull it off. She's from the UK. Bridget McDermott. Check out her book. She's written a really good book on warfare in ancient Egypt. Yeah, here we go. I don't have the cover, but
great.
Yeah. So we correspond quite a bit, and she was actually got me to thinking that the Khopesh may not have been a battlefield weapon in the sense that we're thinking. Yeah.
Interesting.
Very, very interesting. And then also she brought up some really interesting questions concerning the theory of the Khopesh being descended from the Epsilon axe, which is it's basically saying that there's a crescent-shaped axe that was common in the Middle Kingdom. And if you look at this, you can kind of see how this would be the half, and then this right here is the blade. And so it's like this distinctive crescent-shaped blade that the Egyptians used in the Middle Kingdom. So one theory is that the Khopesh was descended from this type of axe, and that it was introduced into Egypt by the Hyksos. And so there's all kinds of problems with that when you think about it. So it's like, well, if the Egyptians already had this type of axe, like why didn't it just evolve from the Egyptian Middle Kingdom axe as opposed to the Hyksos introducing the sickle sword into Egypt? And then, like, what tactical advantage did it provide the fighters? Because the reason why the Epsilon axe went out of use was because armor had gotten better, and those slashing type attacks were not as effective on the battlefield. So the Egyptians started using the penetrative axe. So then, what advantage did the Khopesh, whose basic function was to slash and to cut, what advantage did it provide the fighter in New Kingdom Egypt, And so one of her theories is that it was better suited for elite fighters who were fighting from mounted position on chariots. And that way, from that elevated position, it gave them access to shoulder and neck and head. So again, going into what we do to reconstruct this stuff. So we've already listed looking at living traditions to help us with getting ideas, right? We look at artwork to give us ideas of positions and things of that nature. So the Egyptians didn't write any fight manuals, so there's no fight books, anything like that. What they did do is this. There is a medical manual that's written. It's called the Smith Papyrus. And the Smith Papyrus is basically a surgeon discussing various injuries and how to treat them. And so what we do is we look at that kind of that battlefield forensics to get an understanding of how the weapons were used, how the person was killed. And in this manual, it discusses a lot of edge and impact weapons from swords and spears. So it gives us ideas. Never will you hear me say, well, what I do is like, this was the fighting art of Ramses V, and I've learned this by means of, the god Amun-Ra coming to me. You'll never hear me say that.
I'm relieved.
What we do is we try to look as many sources as possible, and they come from different areas, and we try to put it together in a way that makes sense and that's logical. And so with my friend telling me this putting this idea that maybe even the Khopesh wasn't the close quarter weapons that I'm thinking that it is, then I have to rethink, my whole thing. You know what I'm saying? It's like, oh, okay, well, maybe not. So maybe while I'm looking at the Khopesh and thinking about it as this weapon, maybe really the workhorse in the Egyptian infantry, was the shorter leaf-shaped blade that doesn't get a lot of press, but probably did a lot of the work up close.
Yeah.
So there's that. At the same time, they did leave us a plethora of pictorial references for other combat sports and practices. So wrestling is pretty highly documented in ancient Egypt, and so focusing my attention on what's documented and then trying to fill in the gaps there, I've had to shift a little bit from the Khopesh as like my main focus, but like look at, okay, well, wrestling is highly documented, stick fighting is documented quite a bit, if you want to go really, really hard, you can look at there's certain depictions of how bows are being drawn and carried and launched. So there's things there for reconstruction. So Khopesh might be a thing where I have to step away from it for a little bit, focus in on what's more solid, and then as I go, because you start getting more and more information as you go. So it's kind of that kind of process. I know it's kind of very circular answer to the question, but it's not a very straight linear one. But to answer it in a linear way, to go about reconstructing the Khopesh, you have to be crazy, and you have to be able to look at several different sources, both contemporary with the ancient Egyptians and living traditions that were done in the area that they existed in. And for that, and which I didn't mention, is that we also look at contemporary cultures to the Egyptians at the time. So like in Palestine, sickle swords and Khopesh type weapons were common. And so maybe there's not a reference to it in Egypt, there's a reference to it in these other places. And then also like the weapon again is like it has like this ritual, this spiritual connection to the Egyptians, and its shape was reminiscent of the foreleg of a cow, of an ox, And so when you denote strength and you denote like warriorhood, you say strong. You mentioned a person having a strong arm, a strong hand, strong arm. And that is what you see connected with the Khopesh, is why it was named that. Mm-hmm. So like there's a lot of information that I've learned about the weapon. As far as so as I'm talking, I'm remembering other things. So going back to it being used like the sticks. So in Tutankhamun's tomb, they found two types of Khopesh. They found one that was shorter and edged and lighter, and then they found another one they called the Great Khopesh, which was larger. It was blunt, and what Bridget was postulating is that this larger Khopesh may have been used not as an edged weapon but as an impact weapon, and then that's like a whole another ball game there. So
yeah. I wanted to use the Khopesh as a kind of a control so that viewers can kind of get an idea of what goes into studying a lost weapon system kind of thing. And that's the most extreme type where it's like this, where you have to actually, get stuff from walls, and you have to look at the archaeology, and you have to then look at living traditions. And in fact, you could, if you wanted to, you could read through like you were saying before about people traveling through Egypt and seeing the cultures through time. You might be able to pick up in like inflections and things from there, and so that was really good. A really good explanation of some the most extreme type of reconstructive martial arts.
Yes.
And when you know the extreme, you can kind of infer.
Yes. Yeah. Right. And so, like for example, an easier reconstruction. So, say you were interested in Zulu warfare, right?
I am. I was actually going to bring up Ikwa.
Yes. So a way to go about, of course, we always advocate trying to make connections, because the practices are a lot of times contained within people and within a community. So it's about making connections with people, especially when you can, and it's not always you're not always able to. So say, like, for example, you want to learn about Zulu warfare. Okay, a good place to start would be to learn Nguni stick fighting, right? Zulu stick fighting. It's a great place to start. Now, learning that tradition will teach you a lot of things about how to use your shield, footwork, how to move your weapon around. But the problem becomes this: if the historical accounts say that what made Shaka's army better than the other groups around him was that he reformed the army in the sense that he made the shields larger. He emphasized the close quarter spear, the ikhwa, over other weapons, and the way that they campaigned was done. Formations in the way they campaigned was done differently. And so we hear often, and that's not really my area, but you hear often that the strategy was for Shaka the soldiers to engage shield to shield, lock shields, expose, and then thrust with the spear. So you can study Nguni stick fighting, and you can learn a lot about the culture, the movement culture, the physical culture, and the impact weapons style of fighting with the mace, and even with the axe. You can reconstruct based off of that. But when it comes to learning how to use the ikhwa, you're going to be on your own for the most part. You know what I'm saying? And you're going to have to experiment based off of what you've learned from those accounts and what you've learned from Nguni stick fighting, and then what you can infer and deduce as a fighter. So you have to actually, then you can't use the smaller shields. You got to use the bigger shields. You got to get the ikhwa, and then you have to start practicing. Well, they say that he locked shields, opened up, and thrust. Let's see if we can do this. How can I do this? Which ways are in line with what I know about Nguni style of movement? And that would be a relatively easy reconstruction, that you're looking at a living tradition, you're looking at historical accounts, and then you're doing pressure testing and field testing based off of what you're trying to achieve. And that would be a relatively easy place to start with HAMA.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. I get that completely, because I've read enough about the Zulu War, the Anglo-Zulu War in 1879, and Shaka's army and stuff like that to know the basics of what people think about the Zulu army. I'm just going to say this to sort of exemplify, from a novice position of someone who doesn't really do martial arts, but the mental process is pretty much, you get that information. I got that information, and then I came across Nguni stick fighting as well. I saw some videos of it, and I thought to myself, this is completely in line with how people would probably train, or could possibly train, to fight with an ikhwa and I think they called it nishilangu, which is the brush away shield, or the Great War shield that Shaka used.
Right.
There's different sizes, but it's totally in line whether you're going to use the mace, which is very, very much in line with how you actually hold the Nguni stick, or whether it's with the shield. Just the motions of how you use the shield and the offensive weapon is completely in line with what you read about. You can compare them and you can work that out. And if you just happen to, I'm not trying to plug my own website here, but I transcribed a lot of Zulu accounts of the Battle of Isandlwana, and if you look at the way they use their weapons in battle, there are things to be observed, about how they stab and how they use the shield against a bayonet.
Yeah. And
it's very fascinating if you look into it, and it's really interesting exercise to do. So yeah, I completely get that.
Yeah. What's your website? I'd love to check that out. Especially I have one of our council members, he's focused pretty heavily on it in Nguni reconstruction. So that would be really good for him to.
I'm Adventures in History Land.
Adventures in History. Okay, we're going to be checking you out.
Great. Happy to see you there. Happy to see anybody come by and leave a comment.